Hey everybody, it's Josh. I wanted to talk today about God's relationship with us. I see a lot of people who aren't strong in their faith, or maybe new believers, who are just turned off by some of the things written in the Bible. They think God does these vile things, so why should I believe them? Why should I even bother with that faith? Because that is completely against everything that I know. Numbers 31 comes to mind. Numbers 31 is when God tells his people to attack the Midianites. I hope I'm saying that right, Midianites. And he wants to drive them out. He tells them to, or Moses tells them to kill all the men, all the women, and all the children. So they go, they kill all the men, they capture all the women, bring the women back, and bring the children back with them. And Moses was like, or God tells them, no, what are you doing? God does not approve of this. Because the women were the ones who were leading them into false idol worship, into human sacrifice, into hundreds of years. God had tried to change them, to help them, but they made up their mind that they were going to be a sick society, and they were going to do everything, including sacrificing children. Now, what comes next in Numbers is it's hard to read, especially with modern day sensibilities. And I'll explain why that matters so much. But what happens is they bring the women and the children back. God instructs them through Moses to kill the women so they will not be tempted to live the same way. Then kill the boys, because they do not want the boys to rise up against them, and they've already, I guess, had this situation where, the boys get vengeance after they had just had their entire tribe wiped out. Then they check the girls to see if they are virgins. And the ones who are allowed to be servants, allowed to be slaves. Now, a slave was different at the time. It was usually more like an indentured servant. They serve out their time so they could get food and shelter. But that doesn't make this seem right, according to what we believe, and what we believe especially after Christ. It is hard to read because it seems like they're trafficking, as slaves. And I understand why that is hard for people to read. And there are many things in the Old Testament that are hard to read. But we have to understand that they did this, God gave this order for a reason. God in the Old Testament was guiding his people. We can be shocked and offended by most of the things we see there. We have to understand the relationship with us changes as we evolve as people. Ultimately, he brought us a new covenant. He's had several covenants, and he promised after the flood to not wipe out the people as he did in those days. You know, you had angels coming down and there were just mutant creatures, and I mean, it was a wild time. One that we can't understand at all. We've never had angels coming down and having relations with women or men or whoever. We've never seen angels at all. Well, at least most of us haven't. But he brought us the new covenant of Christ. You see, God was working on purifying us. And we might think, well, oh, that doesn't happen fast enough, or he did it in the wrong way. He could just snap his fingers and bam, those Mennonites would be submissive, would do what he wanted them to do. But that is not how God works. He will intervene when he thinks necessary, when he knows is necessary. For example, in the American Revolutionary War, we see many times where God intervenes, where we were vastly outmanned and outgunned, and God would bring storms or fog in to cover a retreat or cover a strategic move many times. We see it obviously in the New Testament. We see it when Moses parts the Red Sea. Many times in the New Testament. But he intervenes in ways, you'll have to excuse me, the fire truck's coming out. I'll let that pass just a little bit. He guides us in ways where he is not showing everyone who he is. He is not making it clear to people that he is God. He does not want it to be clear to people. He does not want that kind of love. Again, I use the analogy of if you won the lottery. If you won the lottery and then a bunch of, men or women, I don't know which you are or which you prefer, come up to you after and say, "Oh, I've always loved you. I just hadn't realized it. I've always wanted to be with you." You would know, even if you might lie to yourself, you would know they are coming up to you now because you have money. It's the same with power or fame. That is what people chase. And so if God revealed himself to us, we would be slaves to him. We would be robots. We would not love him freely. That is his biggest goal, to have us love him freely, to have us seek him and find him, to give us meaning in this world, along with accomplishing whatever plan he has for mankind. Now, I don't know what the plan is. I've always thought we're in training to be some divine being like him, possibly. But that's just wild speculation. I've gotten that feeling since I've been saved, and I have no basis for that except for the thoughts that God put into my mind. Now, I don't pay attention to those thoughts as much because unless I am clear that God is telling me something, I don't take it as God's word. Sometimes I take it as ego. So I do not know, and it is okay to say you do not know, but it is also okay to speculate, and it is okay to doubt. It is okay to question these things. But these are the morals and there are morals and guidance with God that never changes. Now, obviously, God decides who lives and dies. And God, after Christ walked the earth, that is when the morals and guidance never change. He gave a baseline for us to follow in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is like a map, a guidebook for us to follow. It's full of wisdom, and it's full of deep wisdom. There's layers of wisdom in every single chapter. And if you read them out of context, or you read them out of, especially context for the time, you're going to think many of them are just vile. And it might push you away from Christ. But again, after Christ, those morals and values never changed. And I'll point to one that some people say are a change. Because we've always played God ourselves. We ignored the value and conscience and do what we think is best. That's when we always see our lives turning to a living hell. It's slowly and methodically, as we decide what is best for us, we start getting miserable in life. Now, at first, it is sometimes great. When I've accomplished things, I'm like, wow, I'm the greatest. My head's so swollen, I feel so great. But you have to understand, we are not capable of doing this ourselves and being fulfilled and being happy. If we were, there would be no reason for religion. If we were, the atheist would be right, and the billions would be wrong. And I'm not saying because there's billions who believe that is the correct belief. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there's an inherent pull within almost all of man to seek God, to seek the love of God, to get God's approval. We shouldn't be shocked and offended by what we consider outrages in the New Testament, or the Old Testament, or the New Testament. We have to look at context, and more importantly, what does this mean in our life? Don't change the scriptures to go along with whatever you know or whatever you want. Apply them to your situation. You know, a verse like Numbers 31, that is not going to be relevant in many of our lives. Not many at all. And here, I'll give you another one in 1 Corinthians, when Paul, the Apostle Paul, is telling women they should wear head covers. Now, we point to, look at how sexist he was, and look at how he didn't value women as much as he valued men. That's not true at all. There was a reason Paul was writing to the Corinthians, in Corinth, they were a sick society, just as most of ancient Rome and ancient, the Greek cultures were, the pagan cultures. Here's why you have to understand the context. So in those days, women covered their heads when they worshipped their gods. They also covered their heads to show they were married or they were chaste. That is important because there were tons of prostitutes running around. And there were tons of just wildly sexual deviants. They just basically were like what you hear in ancient Rome with the crazy orgies and all that good stuff. But covering their heads for worship of their pagan gods was a sign of respect when they worshipped. We know that Paul showed them there was an altar for a shrine for the unknown God. Paul went to them and showed them this is the one true God. That one true God is known, not known, but worshipped or spoken of in many cultures, many religions, many mythologies. He told them, you should give your highest respects as you do to your pagan gods when you're worshiping Christ. Or when you're worshiping this unknown God. Because now the unknown God is known through Christ. That is what was so great. You got Yahweh, you've got Shangdi, I talked about, the ancient Chinese God. You've got, obviously, Allah. Many of these religions, I'm speaking of mainly the monotheistic religions now, though, they had the unknown God, and he became known through Christ. That is why it was so important back then. And I'm telling you, Paul let the pagans keep many of their traditions. That's not saying he wanted them to worship the same gods like they were, the false idols. He kept those traditions because he was, I'm going to walk over here because there's somebody coming. They let him keep those traditions because there's nothing wrong. You can worship all kinds of different ways. You can worship as the pagans worship their gods. Obviously, he tells us, especially all through the Old Testament and even into the New a little bit, how human sacrifice and child sacrifice is not good. But the traditions they had, the way they dressed, the symbols they had, there were certain symbols that they kept. We have things like the Christmas tree, or we have things like, the Christmas tree is a good one, the only main one I can think of now. But, there's all kinds of stuff from ancient pagan cultures. And that stuff from ancient pagan cultures isn't necessarily bad unless you are worshiping the pagan gods. Paul showed them there's no problem with this. He wanted to show them, hey, you're being sexual deviants, basically. This is not what Christ taught. He was guiding these people. These are letters he was writing to guide the churches, these brand new infant churches. He wanted them to understand the main values were Christ and his love, and obviously the Ten Commandments, and all the values that Christ taught. Anything beyond that, it didn't really matter that much. God doesn't care where you are when you worship him. God doesn't care what you're wearing. But if you honored a pagan god or a different god in one way, you should probably worship the same way when you're worshiping Christ. Wear the same things, honor him in the same way at least. If not, go above and beyond. These are why things when... Obviously, I've been watching a lot of atheists because I think it's very important for me, not necessarily for you, but for me to be knowledgeable, to have answers to these people. And really, I don't get a lot of answers from, some apologists are good. You know, John Lennox is really good. Pastor Cliff, don't know his last name, can't pronounce it. Just write in Pastor Cliff and you'll see. And Give Me an Answer, I think, is the name of his channel. They are just outstanding. But I also watched an atheist named Aaron Ra and Pastor Cliff and his son Stuart. And that man was vile. And of course, that man brought up Numbers 31. And basically, it's like saying that we should have known the same things back 4,000 to 6,000 years ago as we know now, or lived in the same kind of way. And also, we should know what God's plan is. And after 400 years of trying to guide those Midianites, if I'm saying it wrong, please correct me. I think of this old show I used to watch, Moonanites. Never mind. It was a dumb show. But anyway, we think that we know because we think that we are God. We all do it. I've done it. I guarantee you've done it too. We twist values. We twist our conscience. We twist everything to try to fit God into our own God-shaped void. And that includes atheists, because atheists do it. Atheists are the ones who take things that aren't God and try to shove them into that void. Like I mentioned, they worship self, they worship legacy, they worship science. They worship these things because they think they are so much smarter than the billions of people who've lived, the billions of people who've spent their lives seeking God. They're so much smarter and they are more moral. Because as Aaron Ra says, God is so immoral. He's a sick SOB. He was there cussing it. Like, he would not let, during the interview that I watched, which I've watched a few interviews with him, or debates with him. This last interview it just made me I don't know how Pastor Cliff sat there without just going off on the guy, but he just sat there and took it. And that's what we should do. Because you're not going to get anywhere with these people. You're not. These people are intellectually dishonest. They've made up their mind, but there are some who do not know, who've been swayed by these people, who just are still seeking the truth and God. Those are the people, those are why I'm subjecting myself to watching hours of just these vile people talking horribly about God and Christ. I mean, I think, I'm trying to remember one of the other things real quick before. Oh yeah, it was the verse about Christ not bringing peace to the world, but being a sword. Turning family against family, and as bad as that sounds, that is absolutely true. There's going to be conflict because people are going to despise you for your Christianity. They're going to think you're being holier than thou, and that you're acting like you're too good for us, and blah blah blah. And it's going to be challenging, to say the least. Very hard to say in reality most of the time. But please, just understand, if you've got a question about something that you're doubting, say a verse from the Bible. I mean, I'm not some expert theologian where I memorized the Bible, but I've studied enough, especially these verses that people bring up, the atheists bring up as being just vile, how we shouldn't believe because of these verses in the Bible. They forget about the thousands of other ones, but these are the verses we should pay attention to. Right. They're intellectually dishonest. They are borderline evil people sometimes. And I don't like calling people evil. But that guy, Aaron Ra, he pretty much seemed evil to me. And you have to be, when you are first in the faith especially, or let's say you don't know the scriptures very well, you have to be ready for people like this to come up to you. You have to be ready for anything. Because people are going to say things and give you examples of things, and it's going to just throw you off. And sometimes you have to ask God for the answers. Like, God, why would this happen? The usual answer is he was trying to guide people who were basically in the Stone Age, in the Bronze Age, or before that even. Some people are like, well, they say the earth and the universe is only 6,000 years old or something like that. And it's like, no. There's also a verse where Christ says time is relative to God. One day could be 1,000 years to God. And 1,000 years could be one day. God is outside of time and space. He does not go by these standards that we go by. He does not go by the reality that we go by. He created the reality we go by. He knows, and only he knows, the exact time we must put. He must do everything. He knew the exact time when Christ needed to come to earth. He knew the exact time for me in my life when I needed saved. Because I thought I needed saved way before that, but no, I still had lessons to learn. And he had the perfect sign for me. But I had almost given up, and he knew that. He knew any longer, and I might have given up completely. He comes and he does things, and we are impatient because we are just mortals trying to understand. But he has compassion for us, and he will give us hope and give us strength to get through those hard times until it is time for him to give us the big reveal, our big sign, our enlightened moment. All right, everybody, I'm gonna get on out of here because wind's starting to pick up, the traffic starting to get bad. I need to get home. I love you all. We'll talk to you soon. God bless.